Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you're completely alone? In this video, we dive into 5 terrifying encounters where people were stalked by creatures beyond belief. From dark forests to desolate deserts, these stories will make you question what's really out there. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let us know in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Get ready for a journey into the unknown, and stay with us until the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. The red eyes that haunted our home. The house had always felt quiet, isolated from the world around it. Situated on a large piece of land deep in the Norwegian countryside, it was where Eirik, his younger brother Olav, and their mother, Ingrid, had lived for years after the passing of their grandfather. The property was vast, with acres of forest and fields, but there was one part they rarely ventured near, the old cabin on the edge of the property. Eirik had always been curious about the cabin. His mother had told him it was where his grandfather used to work, storing old tools and trinkets. But for some reason, she had always warned them to stay away. It wasn't until one afternoon, after a long stretch of boredom, that Eirik convinced Olav to explore the cabin with him. The cabin stood weathered and forgotten, hidden behind overgrown bushes and tall grass. The air around it felt thick, as if the very ground held memories of things best left undisturbed. The wooden door creaked as Eirik pushed it open, the sound cutting through the stillness like a warning. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air heavy with dust. Old furniture, tools, and crates were stacked haphazardly, untouched for years. Eirik and Olav wandered through the clutter, their footsteps echoing in the silence. There was nothing remarkable at first, just the decaying remnants of a past long gone. But then, Eirik felt something. It was subtle at first, a chill that crawled up his spine, making the small hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He stopped in the middle of the room, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Olav, noticing his brother's unease, asked if he was okay. Eirik didn't answer right away. He glanced around, his eyes drawn to the dark corners of the room. There was something wrong about the cabin, something unseen, but undeniably present. Without warning, the temperature in the room dropped. The air grew cold, unnaturally so, and a heavy feeling of dread settled over them. Eirik's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the cabin before something worse happened. Grabbing Olav's arm, he pulled him toward the door, both of them stumbling out into the open air, gasping as if they had been holding their breath. Back at the house, the oppressive feeling didn't leave. Eirik could still feel it, a presence that seemed to cling to him, following him back from the cabin. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares. In his dreams, he saw the cabin again, but this time it was different. The air inside was thick with darkness, and at the center of it all were 2 glowing red eyes, watching him. The gaze was cold, piercing, and filled with malice. Eirik tried to run, but no matter where he went, the eyes followed, never blinking, never letting him escape. When he awoke in a cold sweat, he could still feel them, those eyes, watching from the shadows of his room. Eirik couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him since that day in the cabin. The dreams had become a nightly occurrence, each one more vivid than the last. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself back in the cabin, surrounded by shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. And always, those red eyes watched him from the darkness, a constant, menacing presence that made his skin crawl. His brother Olav hadn't mentioned anything strange after their visit to the cabin, but Eirik noticed small changes in him too. Olav was quieter, more withdrawn, spending less time outside and more time close to their mother. He hadn't spoken of the cabin since that day, and Eirik wondered if Olav had felt the same dark presence he had, if it was affecting him too. The house, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt different. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on them. Eirik's mother, Ingrid, seemed oblivious to the change at first, continuing with her daily routine, but even she couldn't ignore the tension that had settled over the house. At night, the sense of being watched was the worst. Eirik would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm his racing thoughts. But no matter how hard he tried, He could feel them, those eyes, lurking just out of sight, hidden in the shadows of his room. He would pull the blankets tighter around himself, as if they could somehow protect him from whatever was out there. But the eyes never left. He could feel their gaze, cold and unblinking, piercing through the darkness. One night, after yet another restless sleep filled with nightmares, Eirik woke with a start. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat up, his room dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the window. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but then he saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the edge of his vision, something moved. At first, Eirik thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but then he saw them. Two glowing red eyes, watching him from the darkness. His breath caught in his throat as a wave of cold fear washed over him. The eyes were there, real, just as they had been in his dreams. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at him with an intensity that made him want to scream. But he couldn't. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming terror that gripped him. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the eyes, too afraid to move. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly in the darkness. Finally, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the eyes disappeared. One blink, and they were gone, swallowed up by the shadows. But even after they vanished, Eirik knew they hadn't really left. The presence was still there, lurking, waiting. And it wasn't just watching him anymore. It was getting closer. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier, almost unbearable. Eirik was no longer the only one affected. His brother Olav, once full of energy and curiosity, had become withdrawn and quiet, spending most of his time in his room. Their mother, Ingrid, noticed the change in both of her sons, but she couldn't seem to pinpoint what was wrong. She had always been practical, dismissing tales of ghosts and curses, but even she couldn't ignore the shift in the house's energy. Eirik tried to talk to Olav about the eyes, about the dreams, but his brother was reluctant to speak. Whenever Eirik mentioned the cabin or the strange feelings that had plagued him since their visit, Olav would shut down, his eyes distant and unfocused. It was clear that Olav was afraid, but he didn't want to acknowledge it. Eirik couldn't blame him. There was something about admitting the presence that made it feel even more real, more powerful. The presence in the house wasn't just something Eirik felt at night anymore. During the day, there were subtle signs that something was wrong. Objects in the house would move on their own, books that had been neatly stacked on the shelf would be found scattered across the floor, doors that were closed would suddenly be open, and cold drafts would blow through the house, even though all the windows were shut. Ingrid began to feel it too. Eirik could see the worry in her eyes, the way she glanced over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind her. At first, she tried to brush it off as stress or the strain of living in such an isolated place, but soon it became clear that there was something more going on. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ingrid finally spoke up. "I've been having strange dreams," she said, her voice low. "Dreams about the cabin. Your grandfather used to spend a lot of time there, but he never told me what he was doing. I always thought it was just a workshop, but now I'm not so sure." Eirik's heart skipped a beat. His mother had never mentioned the cabin before, and hearing her talk about it now filled him with dread. He hadn't told her about the eyes, about the nightmares, or about the presence that seemed to follow him everywhere. But now, he wondered if his grandfather had something to do with whatever was haunting them. That night, Eirik lay awake in his bed, the weight of his mother's words pressing down on him. The air in his room was thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker than usual. He could feel the presence again, watching him from the corners of the room, waiting. And then, just as he had feared, the eyes appeared once more. This time, they were closer, much closer. The red glow pierced through the darkness, locking onto him with a malevolent intensity. Eirik felt a cold sweat break out across his skin, his body trembling as the familiar wave of terror washed over him. He knew, deep down, that whatever was haunting them had its roots in the cabin. And it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. The realization that the cabin held something far darker than they had ever imagined weighed heavily on Eirik. The presence had grown stronger, more oppressive, and the red eyes had become a nightly terror. Eirik wasn't the only one seeing them anymore. His brother Olav had finally confessed, admitting that he, too, had been seeing the eyes, always watching, always waiting. The house felt like a cage, with the presence tightening its grip on them more each day. Ingrid had become more withdrawn, her once strong demeanor cracking under the weight of whatever haunted their family. She no longer dismissed the strange happenings. Every night, the house was filled with strange creaks and whispers that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The air inside had grown cold, the warmth of the home replaced by an unrelenting chill. And always, there was that feeling, like a pair of eyes following their every move. One evening, after another sleepless night filled with nightmares, Ingrid made a decision. "It's time to leave," she said firmly, her voice breaking the silence that had settled over them. "This place, it's no longer safe. Whatever is in that cabin, it's affecting us, and we need to get out before it's too late." Eirik felt a wave of relief at her words. He had been too afraid to suggest leaving, too afraid that acknowledging the power of the presence would somehow make it worse. But hearing his mother say it, hearing the strength in her voice, gave him hope that they could escape. The family wasted no time. Over the next few days, they packed their belongings, each of them moving quickly and quietly, as if afraid that the presence would try to stop them. The house creaked and groaned as they worked, the oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with each passing hour. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. On their final night in the house, the presence made itself known one last time. Eirik was in his room, packing the last of his things when the temperature suddenly dropped. The air became icy, his breath visible in the dim light. He froze, feeling that all too familiar sense of dread wash over him. Slowly, he turned toward the corner of the room, and there they were. The red eyes. They were closer than ever before, hovering just at the edge of his bed, their cold gaze fixed on him. Eirik's heart pounded in his chest as he stared back, unable to move, unable to speak. The eyes burned with a malevolent intensity, and Eirik could feel the presence behind them, ancient, angry, and filled with malice. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. The eyes seemed to draw him in, pulling him deeper into their gaze. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished. Eirik gasped, his body trembling as the room returned to its normal temperature. The presence was gone, but he knew it wasn't finished. It was letting them leave, but it would always be there, waiting in the shadows of the cabin. The next morning, they left the house behind, driving away without looking back. But even as they left, Eirik couldn't shake the feeling that the presence was watching them, its red eyes following them long after the house had disappeared from view. The silent stalker on Edinburgh's streets. Edinburgh at night had a certain magic to it. The streets were quiet, and the historic buildings stood tall, their stone facades bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. Leah and Callum, a couple on a spontaneous trip to Scotland's capital, had spent the evening exploring the city's lively pubs and narrow alleys. It was late, well past midnight, when they decided to take one last walk through the quieter parts of the city before heading back to their hotel. The air was crisp, carrying a hint of mist, and the cobblestone streets felt almost deserted. Leah wrapped her coat tighter around her, while Callum stuffed his hands into his pockets, both enjoying the rare silence of the city that was usually bustling with tourists. They strolled along the Royal Mile, passing by ancient buildings that had stood for centuries, their shadows long and foreboding under the dim light. The night felt peaceful at first, almost serene, but as they moved further from the main streets, an uneasy feeling began to settle over Leah. The narrow alleyways they wandered through seemed to stretch on forever, their walls towering over them, casting deep shadows. The distant sound of footsteps echoing on the cobblestones was the only thing that broke the quiet. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, but then the sound grew louder, more distinct. Leah glanced at Callum, who hadn't seemed to notice yet. She shook off the feeling, telling herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks in the dark. But as they turned a corner and stepped onto a narrow, deserted lane, the footsteps behind them became unmistakable. They weren't alone. Leah's heart skipped a beat. The steps were heavy, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was following them. She grabbed Callum's arm, her voice low and tense as she whispered that they were being followed. He paused, listening carefully, and sure enough, the footsteps stopped too. Callum turned to look behind them, but the alley was empty, just shadows and the dim glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet stones. A chill ran down Leah's spine. She didn't want to believe it, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. It was as though the shadows themselves were alive, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. They stood still for a moment, straining to hear any sound. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and the stillness only made the sensation of danger worse. "We should go," Callum muttered, his voice tight with unease. Leah nodded, her pulse quickening as they began walking again, this time faster. The footsteps resumed almost immediately, louder now, closer. Leah glanced back again, but the street behind them was still empty. No matter how fast they moved, the footsteps followed, always just a few paces behind, relentless and unseen. Their walk through the peaceful streets of Edinburgh had turned into something much darker. They weren't just wandering anymore, they were being hunted. Leah's heart raced as the sound of the footsteps grew louder, echoing off the walls of the narrow alleyway. The once charming streets of Edinburgh had transformed into something dark and threatening. She quickened her pace, pulling Callum along with her, but no matter how fast they moved, the heavy steps followed, matching their speed. There was no mistaking it now, they were being chased. Callum glanced over his shoulder again, but the alley remained empty. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the stone walls. The air had grown colder, almost icy, and the mist that had seemed so light before now clung to the ground, swirling around their feet as they moved. "We need to get out of here," Callum muttered, his voice tense. Leah didn't need to be told twice. She could feel it too, the weight of something unseen pressing down on them, watching, waiting. The footsteps were closer now, and there was something about their sound that chilled her to the bone. They were too slow, too deliberate, as if whatever was following them wasn't in a hurry, it knew they had nowhere to go. They turned down another alley, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was behind them. The street narrowed even further, the walls of the ancient buildings pressing in around them like a maze. The mist thickened, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. Leah's breath came in short, panicked gasps as they moved faster, almost running now, but the footsteps never faltered. They were always there, just behind them, just out of sight. Callum's hand tightened around hers, pulling her along as they turned another corner, this time onto a wider street. But the relief that came with the open space was short-lived. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and in the eerie silence that followed, Leah's ears rang with the sound of her own heartbeat. She glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the street was as empty as the alley they had left behind. Then the footsteps started again, louder this time, as if whatever was following them had closed the distance. Leah's stomach twisted with fear. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her throat was too tight, her voice caught in her chest. They broke into a run, their footsteps pounding against the cobblestones as they darted down yet another alley. The cold air stung Leah's face, and the mist swirled more violently, obscuring their vision. But it wasn't just the mist that made it hard to see, the streetlights above them flickered again, casting everything in an eerie, shadowy glow. Callum pulled Leah to a stop at the end of the alley, his chest heaving as he scanned the streets for any sign of life. But there was nothing, no people, no cars, just the empty streets and the relentless sound of those footsteps. "They're still behind us," Leah whispered, her voice shaking. Callum didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fear in his eyes said everything. They weren't alone, and whatever was following them wasn't going to stop. The tension between Leah and Callum was palpable as they stood at the end of the alley, trying to make sense of the eerie footsteps that had been following them. The air was thick with mist, swirling around them like a shroud, and every breath felt heavier, as if the city itself was pressing down on them. Leah's heart pounded in her chest, and though her legs ached from running, the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her moving. "We can't stay here," Callum whispered urgently, his voice barely audible above the sound of their own breathing. Leah nodded, but fear gripped her, making it difficult to think clearly. The footsteps had stopped for the moment, but she could still feel the presence looming behind them. It was as though they were being stalked, hunted by something they couldn't see. Every nerve in her body screamed that they were in danger, and the longer they stayed, the closer that danger became. Without another word, they bolted down the street, their footsteps echoing loudly off the stone walls around them. The city, once so full of life and history, had become a maze of shadows and narrow passageways, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The streets were completely deserted, not a single person in sight to offer help or even witness what was happening to them. As they turned another corner, Leah's eyes darted around, searching desperately for any sign of safety, a shop, a pub, anything that might still be open at this late hour. But there was nothing. Only darkness and the unnerving silence that seemed to swallow them whole. The mist clung to the ground, twisting and turning like an unseen force guiding them deeper into the city's labyrinth. Then, without warning, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more forceful, as if whatever was following them had grown bolder. Leah could feel her pulse quicken, her skin prickling with cold sweat. It was closer now, much closer, and the heavy thud of each step sent waves of fear rippling through her. Callum's hand tightened around hers as they picked up speed again, their bodies moving as one as they raced through the narrow streets. The sound of the footsteps seemed to grow louder with every passing second, echoing unnervingly in the darkened streets. Leah glanced over her shoulder, her eyes searching the shadows for the source of the noise. But, as before, there was nothing, just the same empty streets, the same oppressive darkness. The presence, however, was undeniable, as if the city itself had come alive to pursue them. Callum suddenly veered off the main street, pulling Leah down another alley, this one narrower than the last. The walls of the buildings felt as though they were closing in on them, the cobblestones beneath their feet slick with moisture from the mist. Leah's breath came in shallow gasps, her legs burning with the effort of running, but they couldn't stop. Not now. The footsteps followed, relentless, unyielding. Leah's mind raced. What was chasing them? Why couldn't they see it? The not knowing was almost worse than the chase itself. Every instinct screamed at her to run faster, but the fear of what might happen if they were caught loomed like a shadow over them. And still, the footsteps grew louder, as if something was just inches behind them, ready to strike. Leah's legs felt like they were going to give out at any moment, her chest burning from the cold air and the relentless pace. Callum's grip on her hand was tight, both of them moving in sheer panic, their feet pounding against the slick cobblestones. The footsteps behind them had grown impossibly loud, as if whatever was following them was right on their heels. And yet, when Leah glanced back, there was still nothing, just shadows and the ever-present mist swirling around them. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but there were no answers. Whatever was chasing them seemed to exist in the shadows, unseen but undeniably present. Every thud of those footsteps sent a fresh wave of terror through her, and the oppressive sense of danger was suffocating. They needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere they could hide. Up ahead, Callum spotted a narrow passageway, a dark gap between two old stone buildings that seemed to offer a brief reprieve from the open streets. Without hesitation, he pulled Leah toward it, the two of them slipping into the tight alley just as the sound of the footsteps reached their loudest. For a moment, everything went silent. Leah pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breathing ragged as she tried to calm the panic that had gripped her. Callum stood beside her, his chest heaving as he listened intently for any sign of movement. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for them to stand side by side, and the walls seemed to close in on them, but it was the only shelter they had. The heavy mist drifted past the entrance of the alley, obscuring their view of the street beyond. Leah's pulse raced, every nerve in her body alert as they waited, frozen in place. The footsteps had stopped again, but the presence hadn't left. It lingered, just beyond their sight, as if it knew exactly where they were. Minutes passed in tense silence, the only sound their labored breathing. Leah's mind buzzed with fear and confusion. What had been following them? Why hadn't they seen it? The darkness around them felt alive, pressing in on them with an unseen force, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. Just as Leah thought the worst was over, a sound cut through the stillness, the faintest shuffle of feet, closer than ever before. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted toward the entrance of the alley. There, in the mist, a shadow moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, hovering at the edge of their vision. Leah's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in terror as she strained to see what it was. But the mist was too thick, the shadows too deep. Whatever was there remained hidden. Callum nudged her, his voice a tense whisper. "We need to go. Now." Without waiting for her response, he pulled her from the alley, back onto the empty street. The footsteps did not resume, but the sense of danger remained, following them like a shadow as they made their way through the maze of alleys and streets, never stopping until they reached the safety of their hotel. Even then, as they closed the door behind them, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the mist, waiting. They never found out what had followed them that night, but the memory of those relentless footsteps, and the unseen danger, would haunt them forever. A midnight encounter with the unknown. It was the middle of the night when Jonas woke up in his grandparents' house. The old farmhouse, nestled deep in the Danish countryside, had always been a quiet place. The creak of the wooden floors, the soft hum of the wind outside, and the faint ticking of the clock in the hall were familiar sounds that usually brought him comfort. But tonight felt different. The silence seemed heavier, almost oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Jonas had stayed with his grandparents many times before, but something about this visit felt off. He couldn't place it. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched longer than usual, or how the air felt colder, despite the warmth of the summer night. He glanced at the clock. It was just past 2 a.m., the time of night when the world felt its most still. His throat dry, Jonas decided to get up and grab a glass of water. He tiptoed through the dark hallway, careful not to wake his grandparents. The old house groaned under his weight, the sound echoing in the stillness, making him feel strangely exposed. The kitchen was just down the hall, its doorway a rectangle of blackness and the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the windows. As Jonas stepped into the kitchen, a sudden chill washed over him. The room, usually so familiar and warm during the day, now felt foreign, almost hostile. He moved toward the sink, but something caught his eye. In the far corner of the kitchen, near the old wooden pantry, a figure stood motionless. Jonas froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was tall and shadowy, its form translucent, as though it didn't fully belong to this world. It was there, and yet not, its outline faint, almost blending into the darkness around it. But what terrified Jonas most were its eyes, deep, hollow pits that seemed to absorb the very light from the room, locking onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Paralyzed by fear, Jonas couldn't move. His legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body refusing to obey. The figure didn't move, but the weight of its presence was overwhelming, pressing down on him, filling the air with a sense of dread so thick it was suffocating. For what felt like an eternity, Jonas stood there, staring at the figure, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears he was sure it could hear him. And then, without warning, the figure seemed to shift, a slight movement that broke the spell holding him in place. Panic surged through Jonas as he turned and bolted from the kitchen, his feet barely touching the floor as he sprinted down the hallway and back into the safety of his room. He slammed the door behind him, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. The house was silent again, but the terror clung to him, as real as the cold sweat on his skin. Jonas collapsed onto his bed, pulling the blankets around him, as if they could somehow protect him from the thing in the kitchen. But even in the darkness of his room, he could still feel it, the presence lurking, watching, waiting. The next morning, the house felt different, though Jonas couldn't quite explain why. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patches of light on the floor, but it did little to ease the tension that lingered in his mind. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, but his eyes kept darting toward the corner where he had seen the figure the night before. His grandparents bustled around the kitchen, going about their usual morning routine as if nothing had changed. But for Jonas, everything felt different. The memory of the figure, its hollow eyes, its shadowy form clung to him like a dark cloud, refusing to fade in the light of day. He didn't dare mention what had happened. His grandparents were practical people, grounded in reality, and Jonas wasn't sure how they would react. Maybe they would laugh it off, dismiss it as a bad dream, or worse, they might sense the fear in his voice and start worrying about him. So, he kept quiet, his thoughts racing as he tried to convince himself that it had all been his imagination. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The day passed slowly, the weight of the previous night hanging over him like a shadow. Jonas tried to distract himself, helping his grandfather with the usual farm chores, but every time he found himself alone, his mind drifted back to the figure in the kitchen. The image of its dark, hollow eyes burned into his memory, impossible to shake. By evening, the sense of unease had grown worse. Jonas couldn't explain it, but there was something wrong with the house, something he had never noticed before. The creaks and groans of the old farmhouse, sounds he had grown so accustomed to, now seemed to take on a different meaning, as though the house itself was trying to tell him something. The shadows, too, seemed darker, longer, and more alive, twisting and shifting just out of sight. That night, as Jonas lay in bed, sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise made him tense, every gust of wind outside his window sent his heart racing. He pulled the blankets tight around him, just as he had the night before, but this time, they didn't provide the comfort he sought. He felt vulnerable, exposed, as though the very walls of the house were closing in on him. Then the nightmares began. In his dreams, Jonas was back in the kitchen. The house was dark, colder than before, and the air felt heavy with dread. The figure was there, standing in the corner, watching him with those same hollow eyes. It didn't move, but Jonas felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting, burning into him. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped, stuck in place as the figure grew closer, its form shifting and darkening, until it was all he could see. The kitchen disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only the figure and its eyes. Jonas woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, but he didn't dare open his eyes. He knew, without looking, that the figure was still there, waiting for him to come back to the kitchen. The following days in the farmhouse were uneasy. Jonas could feel the shift, not just in himself, but in the house as well. It was as though the very air had thickened, weighed down by something unseen. His grandparents continued their usual routines, but Jonas noticed they spent less time in the kitchen. Meals were quick and quiet, and his grandmother no longer lingered at the table for her evening tea. It was as if, on some level, they too felt the change, though no one dared speak of it. Jonas had become hypersensitive to every noise, every creak the old house made. The faintest sound, whether it was the wind or the groan of the wooden beams, set his nerves on edge. He avoided the kitchen as much as possible, choosing instead to help his grandfather outside or hide away in his room. But no matter where he went, the presence followed him. He could feel it, always lurking just beyond his sight, never fully revealing itself but never truly gone. At night, the nightmares continued. They were always the same. He would find himself back in the kitchen, the air thick with a sense of foreboding, the figure standing in the corner, watching. Each dream felt more real than the last, and Jonas would wake up drenched in sweat, his body trembling with fear. The worst part was the feeling that, even when he woke, the figure's gaze never left him. His sleep-deprived state began to take its toll. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his once quiet demeanor became jumpy and anxious. His grandparents noticed but didn't press him for details. There was an unspoken understanding that something was wrong, though no one dared to put it into words. One afternoon, while helping his grandfather with some repairs in the barn, Jonas finally worked up the courage to ask a question that had been gnawing at him since the night he saw the figure. "Did anything strange ever happen in the kitchen when you were younger?" His grandfather paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. For a moment, Jonas thought he wouldn't answer. But then his grandfather sighed, his face taking on a distant, almost troubled expression. "The house has been in the family for generations," his grandfather said slowly. "I've heard stories, whispers about things people have seen late at night." Your great-grandfather used to speak of shadows in the kitchen, but we never gave it much thought. Old houses creak, things move in the night. But his voice trailed off, and he didn't finish the sentence. Jonas didn't need him to. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, confirming what Jonas had feared. The figure he had seen wasn't some figment of his imagination. It was real, something that had been haunting the house long before he was born. That evening, Jonas found himself staring at the kitchen door from the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the figure was there, waiting for him, just as it had been every night since that first encounter. And it was getting harder to resist the pull to go back. The pull toward the kitchen grew stronger with each passing night. Jonas tried to resist, but the figure seemed to be calling him, drawing him back to the place where it all began. The nightmares had become relentless, leaving him exhausted and terrified of what awaited him each time he closed his eyes. But now, it wasn't just in his dreams. The presence had seeped into his waking life, a constant, oppressive weight that followed him through the house. That night, as Jonas lay in bed, he knew he wouldn't be able to ignore the pull any longer. The air in his room felt thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the ceiling, trying to convince himself to stay in bed, to wait until morning when the daylight would chase away the shadows. But the figure was waiting for him. He could feel it. Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, Jonas threw off the covers and crept down the hallway. The house was eerily silent, the creaks and groans of the old farmhouse absent, as if even the building itself was holding its breath. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. Jonas hesitated at the threshold, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open wider. The room was bathed in shadows, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the small window above the sink. Everything was as it had been the first night, the same cold, suffocating air, the same oppressive stillness. And there, in the corner near the pantry, stood the figure. It was just as he remembered, tall, shadowy, and translucent, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. The hollow eyes stared back at him, cold and empty, and yet filled with a malevolent intent that sent a shiver down his spine. Jonas's body froze, the same paralyzing fear that had gripped him that first night returning with full force. His legs refused to move, his breath caught in his throat, and he could feel his heart hammering in his chest. The figure didn't move, but its presence pressed down on Jonas, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. For a moment, he considered running, bolting back to his room and hiding under the covers like a child. But something inside him told him that running wouldn't help. The figure would follow. It always did. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Jonas forced himself to take a step forward, then another. His legs felt heavy, as though the very air around him was trying to hold him back, but he kept moving. He had to know what this thing was, why it was here, and why it wouldn't leave him alone. As he approached the figure, the air grew colder, the shadows deepening around them. The figure seemed to shift, its form flickering like a dying flame. Jonas could feel the weight of its gaze, those hollow eyes piercing through him, and for a moment, he thought he saw something else in the darkness, something ancient, something angry. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. The room was silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting as if nothing had ever been there. Jonas stood in the middle of the kitchen, his body trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure was gone, but he knew it wasn't truly gone. It was part of the house, part of the shadows, and it would always be waiting. Jonas never saw the figure again after that night, but he knew it was still there, watching from the corners of the house, lurking in the dark. Hunted by a cryptid in the woods. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth as Eric and his father moved through the forest. The leaves crunched softly beneath their boots, and the sound of distant birds filled the silence between them. Hunting trips had been a family tradition for as long as Eric could remember, and these quiet moments in the woods with his father were something he cherished. But today, there was a heaviness in the air that he couldn't quite place. They had left the cabin before sunrise, making their way deeper into the thick woods surrounding the Norwegian countryside. Eric's father had spotted deer tracks earlier, and they were following them, hopeful for a successful hunt. Eric had always enjoyed the thrill of the chase, the quiet stillness of the forest, and the way nature seemed to come alive when they least expected it. But as they walked, something felt off. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of wildlife, seemed unusually quiet. The birds, which had been so vocal earlier, had fallen silent, and the only sound Eric could hear was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. His father didn't seem to notice, his focus fixed on the trail ahead, but Eric couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The path they followed became less defined, and Eric's father signaled for him to stay quiet. They were close, he could feel it. The tracks had led them to a clearing just beyond the next rise, where Eric hoped they would spot the deer they had been tracking. But when they reached the top of the hill and looked down into the clearing, Eric froze. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. In the middle of the clearing, partially obscured by the underbrush, stood a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It was tall, far taller than any human, with long, bony limbs and a hunched back. Its skin was a mottled gray, blending into the shadows around it, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace as it dragged a dead deer across the ground. Eric's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest, and his legs felt as though they had turned to stone. He wanted to call out to his father, to warn him, but the words stuck in his throat. The creature hadn't noticed them yet. It seemed completely focused on its prey, its long arms gripping the deer's lifeless body as it dragged it toward the trees. The sight of the creature sent a chill through Eric that he couldn't explain. It was something primal, something that told him this wasn't just an animal, it was something else. Something that didn't belong here. He glanced at his father, who was crouched low beside him, his eyes wide with shock. For the first time, Eric saw fear in his father's face. They needed to leave. Eric's mind raced as he crouched low next to his father, the creature still dragging the deer across the clearing. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath shallow and rapid as fear coursed through him. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. He couldn't take his eyes off the creature, its slow, deliberate movements unlike anything he had ever seen. His father, normally so calm and composed, looked pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had hunted these woods his entire life, knew every sound, every animal that roamed the trees, but this was something else. Something that neither of them could explain. Eric reached out, gently tugging his father's sleeve, urging him to back away. His father nodded slowly, the shock still evident on his face. They needed to leave, and they needed to do it quietly. The creature hadn't noticed them yet, and Eric wanted to keep it that way. His heart raced as he turned, moving as silently as he could, careful not to make any noise that might draw the creature's attention. Step by step, they began to retreat, slipping back into the cover of the trees. Eric's body felt like it was on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig making him flinch. The forest, once so familiar, now felt like a maze of dangers, and every shadow seemed to hold some hidden threat. They had barely made it a few feet when the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush made Eric freeze. His heart stopped. The creature had stopped moving, and the forest was once again eerily silent. Eric didn't dare turn around to look, but he knew, he could feel it, that the creature had sensed something. For a moment, time seemed to stretch on endlessly, the silence hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. Then, without warning, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees, sending a wave of terror through Eric's entire body. He had never heard anything like it before, an unnatural, primal sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath his feet. That was all it took. Eric bolted, his legs finally obeying the command to run. He didn't look back, didn't think about anything other than getting away from the creature. His father was right behind him, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor as they sprinted through the trees. Branches whipped at their faces, the underbrush catching at their legs, but they didn't stop. The forest blurred around them as they ran, the creature's growl still ringing in Eric's ears. The world had narrowed down to a single instinct: survival. The fear that gripped him was unlike anything he had ever felt, a deep, primal terror that came from the knowledge that something dangerous, something unnatural, was chasing them. Eric didn't know how long they ran, but eventually, the trees began to thin, the familiar path leading back to the cabin coming into view. His chest burned, his legs ached, but he pushed himself to keep going, not daring to slow down until they were safely inside. But even then, as they slammed the door shut behind them, Eric knew they weren't safe. Not really. Because whatever that creature was, it was still out there. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the small cabin as Eric and his father stood panting, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest outside was quiet once more, but the heavy feeling of dread hadn't left. Eric's heart still raced, and the image of the creature, dragging the deer through the clearing, was burned into his mind. His father paced near the window, peeking through the curtains as if expecting the creature to follow them back. The cabin, usually a safe haven during their hunting trips, now felt fragile, as though the thin walls couldn't keep out whatever lurked in the woods. Eric, still shaken, finally spoke. "What was that thing?" His voice trembled, and he hated how small it sounded. His father didn't answer right away. He just kept staring out the window, his face tense, eyes scanning the tree line as if he expected the creature to appear at any moment. Finally, he sighed and turned to face Eric, the fear in his eyes undeniable. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've hunted these woods my whole life, and I've never seen anything like that." Eric's stomach twisted with unease. His father was the most experienced hunter he knew, someone who could identify every sound and track in the forest. If even he didn't know what they had seen, that meant it wasn't something natural. It wasn't an animal they could explain away. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. They stayed inside the cabin, neither of them willing to venture back into the woods. Eric couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though the creature was nowhere to be seen. The forest felt different now, as if the very trees were hiding something from them, something they weren't meant to see. Later that afternoon, they cautiously retraced their steps to the clearing. Armed with rifles, they moved slowly, carefully scanning the area. The tracks they had followed earlier were still there, but there was no sign of the deer or the creature. It was as if the entire scene had vanished, leaving behind only an unsettling quiet. They scoured the clearing, looking for any clue, but the ground was undisturbed. Eric's father knelt down, examining the soil, his brow furrowed in confusion. "There should be something," he muttered. "Tracks, blood, anything." But there was nothing. No signs of the deer, no drag marks where the creature had pulled it through the clearing. The forest was eerily calm, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Eric's mind raced with possibilities. Had they imagined it? Had the fear of the moment distorted what they had seen? But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget the creature's hulking form, the way its long arms had gripped the deer, the strange, unnatural movements it made as it disappeared into the trees. Whatever it wasn't something natural. It wasn't something explainable. As they walked back to the cabin, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was hiding a secret, one they had glimpsed, but could never truly understand. Days passed, but the memory of the creature haunted Eric. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again, the way its elongated limbs moved as it dragged the deer, the eerie stillness that had settled over the forest when it appeared. Even in the safety of the cabin, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting in the shadows. His father had grown quieter since the encounter. He spent most of his time by the window, scanning the tree line as if expecting the creature to return. They hadn't spoken much about what had happened, but Eric knew his father was just as shaken as he was. The man who had once been so sure of himself in the woods now seemed unsure, hesitant to venture too far from the cabin. They continued their hunting trip, but it wasn't the same. The forest, once a place of peace and familiarity, had turned into a place of tension and fear. Eric found himself jumping at every sound, his senses on high alert for any sign of movement. His father, too, was more cautious, constantly checking their surroundings as if the creature might appear at any moment. One evening, as they sat in the cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, Eric finally spoke up. "Do you think we'll ever know what it was?" His father didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across his face. After a long pause, he shook his head. "Some things out here, Eric, they're not meant to be understood." Eric nodded, though the words offered little comfort. He had always thought of the forest as a place where everything had an explanation, where every track, every sound, could be identified. But this creature, this thing they had seen, defied everything he thought he knew about the natural world. That night, Eric lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind whispered through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch breaking the silence. He knew it was unlikely that they would ever see the creature again, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl of wind sent a shiver down his spine. In the following weeks, Eric and his father returned home, but the encounter stayed with them. They never spoke about it to anyone else. Who would believe them? Even now, years later, the memory remained vivid in Eric's mind. He had heard stories, of course, about creatures that lived deep in the woods, creatures that defied logic and reason. Cryptids, they were called, beings that existed on the edge of myth and reality. Eric never saw the creature again, but he knew it was still out there, somewhere in the dense forests of Norway. And every time he returned to the woods, he couldn't help but wonder if, just beyond the trees, it was watching him. The deer was never found, and the clearing remained untouched, as if the encounter had never happened at all. But Eric knew the truth. Something had been there that day, something ancient, something unknown. And it was something he would never forget. The night they encountered skinwalkers. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Anton and his friends set out for their hunting trip deep in the Arizona desert. The air was still warm from the day, but the coming night brought with it an eerie stillness. The desert, which had always seemed so vast and open, now felt like it was closing in, the shadows stretching longer as they moved further from camp. Anton, leading the group, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though he couldn't quite place what it was. They had been hunting these lands for years, tracking deer and small game, and the desert had always felt like home to him. But tonight, there was something different. The usual sounds of the desert, crickets, distant coyotes, the rustling of the wind through the cacti, were absent. The silence was unsettling, and Anton felt his skin prickle with unease. As they moved deeper into the scrubland, something caught Anton's eye. A movement just ahead, too fast to be an animal but too fluid to be human. He stopped, raising his hand to signal the others to halt. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area, trying to make sense of what he had seen. That's when they heard it. A deep, guttural growl cut through the silence, sending a chill down Anton's spine. It came from the direction of the movement, low and menacing, like nothing he had ever heard before. His friends, standing behind him, exchanged uneasy glances, their hands instinctively moving to their rifles. The growl came again, louder this time, and with it, the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. Anton's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, far taller than any man, its body gaunt and twisted, with limbs too long for its frame. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes, black and empty, seemed to gleam in the fading light. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, its long arms reaching out as it lunged towards something in the distance. A deer. Before Anton could process what he was seeing, the creature pounced, its movements swift and precise. In one fluid motion, it brought the deer to the ground, its sharp claws digging into the animal's flesh. The deer let out a high-pitched scream before falling silent, its body limp under the weight of the creature. Anton felt his blood run cold. The scene before him was something out of a nightmare. This wasn't an animal, was it anything he could explain? His mind raced, struggling to comprehend the sight before him, but every instinct told him to run. The creature, seemingly unaware of their presence, tore into the deer with a ferocity that left Anton frozen in place. He wanted to call out to his friends, to warn them, but his voice had abandoned him. His legs trembled, his heart racing as he realized they were witnessing something they were never meant to see. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the bloodied carcass of the deer. The moment the creature disappeared into the shadows, Anton's breath returned in a ragged gasp. His body trembled, the shock of what he had just witnessed settling over him like a thick fog. His friends stood frozen behind him, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. No one spoke. It was as if they were all trying to process the impossibility of what they had just seen. Anton's hands shook as he gripped his rifle tighter, his mind racing. This wasn't a normal hunting trip anymore, this was something else entirely. He couldn't shake the image of the creature, its thin, twisted frame, its black, soulless eyes. It was unlike anything he had ever imagined, and he knew, deep down, that whatever it wasn't something natural. "We need to leave," Anton whispered, barely able to get the words out. His voice sounded strange in the oppressive silence of the desert night. His friend Marcus, always the skeptic, shook his head, though his usual bravado had faded. "What was that thing?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "It didn't look real." Anton didn't have an answer. None of them did. All he knew was that they needed to get out of the area, fast. The desert, once a place of familiarity and comfort, now felt hostile, dangerous. There was no telling if the creature was still nearby, watching them from the shadows, waiting to strike again. The group quickly gathered their gear, their movements tense and frantic. Every sound, every rustle of the wind through the brush made Anton's heart leap into his throat. He could feel the presence of the creature still, as though it hadn't truly left, just waiting for the right moment to reappear. As they made their way back through the desert, the fear gnawed at them, growing with every step. The wind had picked up, whipping sand into their faces, and the once clear path back to camp now seemed like a maze of shifting shadows and disorienting darkness. The night had fully descended, and with it, the desert became an endless expanse of unknown threats. They had been walking for what felt like hours when they heard it, the low growl again, this time closer, almost too close. Anton's heart nearly stopped as he whipped around, scanning the horizon. His pulse pounded in his ears, his body going cold as the growl echoed through the night. Something was following them. The panic set in almost immediately. Anton's mind raced, his thoughts jumbled and frantic. The creature, they had left it behind, hadn't they? But now, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just one creature. It couldn't be. There had to be more. Marcus swore under his breath, his eyes wide with terror as he glanced at Anton. "We have to run." Anton nodded, barely able to breathe as he felt the weight of the situation settle over him. They had no choice. Whatever was out there, it was coming for them. Without a second thought, the group took off, sprinting through the sand, their feet pounding against the ground as the growl grew louder behind them. The desert was no longer silent. It was hunting them. Anton's lungs burned as he ran, the cold desert air cutting through him like shards of ice. His legs ached, and every breath felt like fire in his chest, but he didn't dare slow down. The sound of footsteps crashing through the brush behind them, heavy, relentless, sent a jolt of fear through his body. He could hear the others close by, their panicked breathing mingling with the sound of their boots pounding the hard ground, but all he could think about was getting away. The creature's growls echoed through the night, each one louder, more menacing than the last. Anton didn't dare look back, but he could feel it, the weight of its presence, looming just out of sight, hidden in the shadows. The thought of those dark, hollow eyes watching him sent a shiver down his spine, pushing him to run even faster. The desert stretched on endlessly in front of them, a maze of rocky terrain and shifting sand. The darkness pressed in around them, the stars above offering little light as they scrambled over rocks and through scrubland. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of sand beneath their feet, the harsh rustle of the wind through the brush, the pounding of their hearts in their ears. Anton's mind raced, searching for any sense of direction, but the desert had become disorienting. The familiar paths they had taken so many times before now felt foreign, twisted by the night. He had lost track of how far they had run, how long they had been fleeing the creature. All he knew was that they couldn't stop. Not until they were safe. But as the growls grew louder, closer, Anton's hope began to wane. The creature, or creatures, were closing in. He could feel it. The realization hit him hard. They weren't going to outrun them. Panic clawed at his throat as he glanced over at Marcus, whose face was pale and drenched in sweat. His eyes were wide with terror, and for the first time since they had started running, Anton saw the same fear reflected back at him. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash to their left. Anton whipped his head around just in time to see something large and dark hurtling through the brush, moving faster than any animal he had ever seen. His heart leaped into his throat as the shape barreled toward them, its long limbs moving with an unnatural speed, its growl reverberating through the night air. Anton shouted, "Split up," and without waiting for a response, he veered off to the right, his feet slipping on the loose sand as he scrambled to get away. The others followed suit, their figures disappearing into the darkness as they scattered in different directions. The hope was to confuse whatever was hunting them, to buy themselves just enough time to escape. But Anton's heart sank as he heard the growl again, closer this time, the sound of snapping branches and shifting sand telling him that the creature had locked onto him. His legs burned as he pushed himself harder, his pulse thundering in his ears, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't be able to outrun it forever. The desert had turned against them. And whatever was following, it was faster, smarter, and it wasn't going to stop. Anton's legs felt like they were going to give out at any moment. The burning in his muscles had turned into a sharp, aching pain, and every breath was a struggle. The growls behind him hadn't stopped, and he could hear the creature's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, gaining on him. His mind raced, searching for a plan, any way out, but all he could focus on was the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the air. The desert had swallowed up the others, leaving Anton alone in the endless expanse of sand and shadows. The darkness pressed in around him, and no matter how fast he ran, it felt like the creature was always just a step behind, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. He couldn't run much longer. He knew that. But the fear of stopping, of facing whatever was chasing him, was too much to bear. Just as he thought his legs would give out, Anton spotted a rocky outcropping up ahead, a small cluster of jagged boulders rising out of the desert like a beacon of hope. If he could reach it, maybe, just maybe, he could find some cover, a place to hide. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed himself toward the rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The growl behind him grew louder, more guttural, and Anton felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw it, the creature, barely visible in the darkness, its long limbs moving with terrifying speed. Its pale, skeletal form seemed to blend into the night, but its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, gleamed with a hunger that made Anton's blood run cold. Panic surged through him, and with one final burst of energy, he threw himself toward the rocks, his body crashing into the jagged surface as he scrambled for cover. His hands scraped against the rough stone, but he didn't care. He had to hide, had to get out of sight before the creature reached him. For a moment, everything was silent. Anton crouched behind the rocks, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The desert was still, the wind whispering through the scrubland. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, but all he could hear was his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. Then, out of the darkness, came the sound of footsteps. Anton's blood turned to ice as the footsteps grew louder, closer. He pressed himself against the rocks, trying to make himself as small as possible. The creature was near, he could feel it, sense its presence like a cold shadow creeping over him. His mind screamed at him to run, to keep moving, but his body was frozen in place. And then, the footsteps stopped. Anton held his breath, his entire body trembling. He knew the creature was just beyond the rocks, waiting, watching. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching out into an eternity. He could feel the weight of its gaze, those empty eyes boring into him, searching. The silence was unbearable. Then, without warning, the creature let out a guttural snarl and moved away, its footsteps fading into the distance. Anton didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe until the sound had completely disappeared into the night. When he finally stood, his legs shaking, the desert was empty once more. The creature was gone, but Anton knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it had let him live, for now. But the fear remained. The desert would never be the same. And neither would Anton. And now, after hearing these spine-chilling encounters, which one left you with goosebumps? Was it the creature in the desert, the figure lurking in the shadows, or something even darker? Let us know in the comments, and if you've ever experienced something terrifying yourself, we'd love to hear your story. Remember, your voice is what makes this community special. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, it helps the channel grow. And don't leave just yet, there are more terrifying stories waiting for you here. Stay curious, and stay safe.